So now we're going to talk about your podcast cover art. Before I jump into the specifications and the do's and the don'ts, I want to actually pause for a second and tell you about why your podcast cover art is so important. So essentially, unlike other mediums, when it comes to podcasting, there are only a couple of things that a potential listener has the opportunity to see before they decide to commit or not to commit to listening to your show. When they're scrolling through their favorite podcast app, the options that they have in front of them are essentially, more often than not, just your podcast cover art and your podcast name. So this is why it's exceedingly important for you to get these two things right. We've already talked about how to name your podcast, and we've talked about why your podcast name needs to be crisp. It needs to, very well articulate what your podcast is going to be about, for it not to be ambiguous. And a lot of the same rules apply for your podcast cover art. You don't want somebody seeing your podcast cover art thinking that your podcast cover, what your podcast is about something, and clicking into your show and then finding out that it's about something altogether different. So your first pro tip here is to just think about your podcast cover art from the eyes of your listener or your potential listener. But your potential listener at this point only has two pieces of information. They just have your podcast cover art and they just have your podcast name, and they have to make a decision on the basis of this. And that's why you need to get it right. You need to get both right. So first, let's get a couple of the more technical and boring things out of the way. So specifications on your podcast cover art. So your podcast cover art needs to be in square shape. It needs to be between 1400 pixels and 1400 pixels. So that's one option that you guys have. Or the other option that you guys have is 3000 pixels and 3000 pixels. The second thing that you guys need to consider is that your podcast cover art shouldn't be larger than 500 KB. This is for a plethora of reasons, for faster load times, and also because certain platforms only allow podcast cover arts that are of a specific size. So you don't want to be delisted for something as trivial as this. Now, when it actually comes to how to design your podcast cover art, the first question is, where should I design my podcast cover art? So if you're looking to do this individually, and if you're a first-time podcaster, against popular belief, I believe you should try doing this on your own, because there are a lot of tools that actually exist today that make this quite a lot easier than it used to be. So go to Canva. Hubhopper is already integrated with Canva. So if you're going through the Hubhopper journey, then you'll already find Canva as a part of that journey at the point of your cover art. And when you enter Canva within the Hubhopper ecosystem itself, at that point, you can just search for podcast cover art, or you can have a prefix with the type of genre that you're in. So horror podcast cover art, and see specific options that are there, and you can seek inspiration from there. And then start to design your podcast cover art. Let's say hypothetically you're somebody that's not a designer at all, or you have a large amount of repetition with going down the design route yourself, which, to be really honest, in today's day and age shouldn't be the case because it's easier than ever. You have the option of going to platforms like Fiverr, and on Fiverr you'll be able to find plethora of different designers that be able to create your podcast cover art. So that's where you create your podcast cover art. Now, there are a few other considerations that you need to keep in mind. So the first thing is that you need to think about your ICP, and you need to think about what emotion you wish to invoke within them. So remember, you have a very small fraction of time in which you can do this. So your podcast cover art needs to really focus down on one specific pinpoint emotion, and you need to drill that emotion into the minds of your potential listeners. When it comes to podcast cover art, a few of the things that you need to keep in mind is that you need to try to be as bold as possible. As we mentioned before, basically with the podcast cover art, it's about standing out from a crowd. So be as bold, be more bold than you would normally be with colors, be more bold than you would normally be with imagery, because you need eyes drawn towards your podcast cover art as opposed to the thousands of other podcast cover arts that are out there. So that's definitely something that you should be keeping in mind. Remember, on a phone screen, the cover arts are extremely small. So for you to put small detailing or for you to put a large amount of text will actually do you more harm than good. So try to stay away from that. Stick to, vibrant imagery. Stick to imagery of people. But if you're putting a person, make sure that the person is covering a large part of the cover art itself and has a specific expression that creates the feeling of some sort of emotion in the eyes of your potential listener at this point in time. You can always change your cover art going forward, but these are just a few do's and don'ts that, exist regardless of whether you're creating your cover art for the first time or whether you're creating your cover art for the 60th time. A great hack when it comes to actually a podcast cover art is go to the new and noteworthy section on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of your favorite podcast listening apps. Now, the reason why you should go to this specific section is because these podcasts haven't built an audience yet. There is something that is getting people to click on these podcasts. And more often than not, I can bet that it's actually in large part due to either the cover art or due to the title. You yourself will be able to make a distinction as if there's a specific very noteworthy individual that is creating a podcast and that has fallen into the new and noteworthy section. You can discount those podcasts. If there's somebody that not everybody knows and still falls into that specific section, it's probably because of one of these two variables. So this can be a good benchmark for you guys to actually look at and for you guys to seek inspiration from whilst creating a podcast cover art. Don't stress too much about this. Just remember the specifications. Remember that it needs to be bold. Remember that you need to draw people's eyes towards your podcast cover art as opposed to other people's podcast cover art. It needs to be obvious with regards to what your show is going to be about. Think about your podcast cover art. If this is going to make your life a lot easier, think about your podcast cover art as a movie poster or as a old school CD album cover. And the second you start thinking down that particular trajectory, you'll get the drift of what you need essentially to do. You have to make your movie poster stand out in comparison to all the other movie posters that exist. So this is your movie poster, and that's why you have to really kill it. Don't take stress. A lot of podcasts that actually have launched, they have taken their initial podcast cover art and they've iterated on it, and they've actually improved on it over the years. The reason why I personally prefer the creator themselves making the podcast cover art is because at this point in your journey, the podcast is your vision. You know it better than anybody. And you know where you want it to go, and you know your user or your listener or your ICP better than anybody. You've got a specific person in mind. When you give it to a designer, whilst they may be able to come up with something more aesthetic, they may not have all of these other factors in place as well as you. So maybe that's something that you can do in round 2 or round 3, but that's always why I like when first-time podcasters come into podcasting, for them to take a stab at designing themselves. Within the process itself, you'll find Canva, and that should make your journey a lot easier. So I hope that helps.